Increase Lapham, Curly Radke, Pearl Pohl. These individuals and many more have played important roles in Wisconsin's conservation history. Each year since 1985, people have been inducted into the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame who have significantly contributed to conservation programs, projects, public understanding, and conservation ethics within the state of Wisconsin and the nation. But who were these people? Each inductee has a unique story that we can use as inspiration in our own lives. Our state and our country would not be what it is today without the tireless efforts of many individuals throughout our state's history. Conservation brings together many different types of people, and the Horicon Marsh is a perfect example. Wisconsin's conservation history is enfolded in the story of Horicon Marsh.
The story of Horicon Marsh is not just the story of this marsh, but really is a parallel to what was happening to wetlands all across the country. What makes Horicon so unique is that here everything you can imagine trying to do to a wetland all occurred on this single marsh, and it took place on a very large scale. And so with that, I think Horicon is not only its own story, but is really a representation of the changing human relationship with wetlands as we saw happen throughout America. Horicon Marsh is, of course, a creation of the last ice age, and humans actually arrived on the scene right at the end of that ice age, and we do have evidence for the early Paleo Indians or mammoth hunters having been here. And as we look at the archaeological record, what we find is evidence of nearly every major prehistoric Indian culture known to the upper Midwest having either utilized or inhabited Horicon Marsh over the last 12,000 years.
Increase Lapham was the father of Wisconsin's conservation movement. Lapham moved to the frontier town of Milwaukee in 1836, 3 days before Wisconsin became a state. Father of the National Weather Service, Wisconsin's first scientist, the first to chronicle the state's geography, the first to record the state's Native American mounds, founder of the Wisconsin Academy of Sciences, Arts, and Letters, the first to report the devastation of the white pine forests. Increase had the foresight to shape our state's future.
It is perhaps the most extensive marsh in Wisconsin, being 14 miles long, 5 miles wide, and covering an area of 44 square miles. It is a fact of some importance in deciding upon the general characteristics of the mound builders that they have selected the same localities as their successors, and probably for the same reasons. Because what he's saying is that we should be thinking of the mound builders, the Native Americans who were here, not so much as a different people, another people, but as people who were very similar to us, having the same needs and wants, and fulfilling those in the same places. But anyhow, he starts out his life, they're traveling a lot, so he doesn't get much in the way of formal education, and perhaps 5 years of schooling, as we would think of it today. He actually tried to get into Yale. There was a contemporary of his who tried to arrange for him to get into Yale, but it never happened. But instead, he came to Milwaukee at a time that there are only 50 houses in Milwaukee. And he is able to become involved in everything. And to me, that is what makes him fascinating. He had this insatiable curiosity for the world around him. And I just imagine him getting up out of bed every morning and just jumping up and saying, I wonder what I can learn today. He's this very interesting combination of being both very humble but also very confident. He's a Quaker by religion. He's raised in a Quaker family. And I suspect because of that, he was kind of had bred into him this rather humble approach to the world. But he also knew that he had a great deal of knowledge and pursued things that he wanted to pursue. Later on, he is asked to be an instructor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and he turns it down because he says he doesn't know enough to be an instructor at a fine university. Yet at the same time, he's founding a women's college in Milwaukee. You know, as you read his letters, as you read his writing, he seems like an extremely gentle man. He seems like the kind of guy who you just kind of like to go out for a walk with.
Lapham knew the importance of sharing his knowledge with others and would often invite his daughters and neighborhood children on expeditions.
Just about a year before his death, he was measuring a mound in Milwaukee with the young daughter of a neighbor. And on his kind of official sketch of that mound, it is, he signs it, Dr. Increase Lapham, assisted by, and Nellie, I've forgotten her last name, but it's, he obviously cares for these kids. He was not a specialist by any stretch of the imagination. He was a generalist. And that idea of being able to see how various parts of what we do in our lives, what we do as humans, what we do as managers of land, that these things all affect each other, and there's that interaction. And that to me is the one piece that makes Lapham special, is he is seeing that all of these pieces come together.
Increase Lapham's love of learning and unlimited personal drive became the foundation for conservation in Wisconsin. Paul Husting was an individual who felt a personal responsibility to ensure public water rights. Like other conservationists in Wisconsin, Husting was someone who took important matters into his own hands.
Paul Husting was a state senator. He was an attorney by training. He came from the city of Mayville, which is just on the east side of Horicon Marsh. And it turns out that in the early 1900s, he was the president of the Greenhead Hunting Club. Well, on the west side of the marsh was the Diana Shooting Club, which was, of course, the out-of-towner club for the wealthy people from out of the area. And they actually built a dam on the west branch of the Rock River in the marsh. They flooded a huge area to create wonderful waterfowl habitat for themselves, hand-dug a channel from the clubhouse out to the marsh for access, and then hired 2 private wardens who would arrest anybody who dared to come into their corner of the marsh. Paul Husting, as an attorney, understood something of Wisconsin's water resource rights and history. He recognized that we had as a territory what was called the Northwest Ordinance that declared all navigable waters to always be free and available for public use and transportation. Those were the early highways. When Wisconsin became a state, we took the Northwest Ordinance and adopted that into the state constitution. And so what Paul Husting did was, in the year 1914, he took his boat, paddled across the marsh into the grounds of the Diana Shooting Club, had himself arrested, and then defended himself, appealed this case, and took it all the way up to the state Supreme Court. The state Supreme Court ruled in favor of Paul Husting, and his argument was this: how can you arrest me for being on what is a publicly navigable waterway? And what we find is that still today, in many of the legal challenges over the public trust doctrine, Wisconsin DNR and many others will cite Husting versus the Diana Shooting Club as a major precedent-setting law case that reinforced public rights for navigable waterways. So this was an extremely important case that still has its repercussions today.
A native of Horicon, Louis Curly Radke dedicated his life to educating the public about the urgency of saving the marsh. In 1927, the state legislature passed a bill to restore the marsh as a wildlife refuge. Radke passionately worked to assure the future of the marsh by organizing such events as Duck Liberation Day and by gaining federal government involvement. An employee of the John Deere Company for 46 years, Curly Radke's real job was restoring and protecting wildlife habitat.
My grandfather was born and raised in Horicon, and he, like many people of his era, grew up hunting and fishing. As a matter of fact, he helped put food on the table for his family by hunting and fishing. So he had a very personal connection with the marsh, as did most people who lived in that area. And I think for him, the idea that the whole marsh would just disappear and it would become drained farmland and all of these beautiful ducks and geese and animals that called the marsh home was unthinkable for him. So, like many people, it became a priority for him to invest his personal time in trying to save the marsh. My grandfather had a lot of talent. He was a great speaker and an amazing singer. And so my mother, who was an accomplished pianist, tells the story about how they would go around to community meetings, not just in the Horicon and Dodge County area, but all of Wisconsin and the Midwest, to give speeches on the topic of the Horicon Marsh and why it was so important to save the marsh. But they would also sing songs. In a time when there wasn't a lot of entertainment, if somebody came to town to not only sing their favorite songs, but also give a talk about an important topic, people turned out. So Curly and my mother, Lois, they were on the circuit. And I think that built up energy and familiarity with the issue way beyond just people who cared about hunting and fishing. He used his talents to win the message. As you can see, he was not a shy guy. Curly was willing to reach out to many organizations, invite the legislature, invite the governor, bring him to town. So you can see that he was willing to take the kinds of steps that really built the energy and the support from not just his community in the region, but the whole nation. For a man who didn't even have a high school education, accomplished amazing things. He's unquestionably one of my great heroes because he took a problem that could have very easily been one of those things that no one really took ownership of. You know, because at the time the prevailing thought was, well, sure, just drain it, turn it into farmland, we need more farmland. It would have been very easy, particularly for a guy in his line of work, to simply say, you know, this is too hot to handle, I think I'll let somebody else worry about this problem. His personal commitment to conservation and to seeing the Horicon Marsh as it is today, that he had that vision and he wouldn't give up on the vision, is a tremendous inspiration to me. And I think it should be an inspiration to people of this generation. You know, we look at all of the controversies associated with environmental causes today and say, you know, we're just completely outgunned, we're outspent by large industrial and corporate interests and land developers, so why don't we just give up and go with the flow? People like Curly Radke said, I'm never going to give up. His life was threatened many times. When Curly went traveling around Wisconsin to give his speeches, he carried a pistol with him because he knew that he was a threat to the establishment. So getting both the Wisconsin legislature and Congress to do something that was not politically acceptable but had a long-lasting impact on the entire region, not to mention all of the fish and wildlife and birds that call that place home. He's a hero.
Curly Radke demonstrates what each of us can do for future generations. Beginning in the 1930s, an age when women were not taken seriously in natural resources, Wilhelmina La Budde was an outspoken leader in conservation. After her two oldest children left for college, Wilhelmina La Budde worked tirelessly on a range of topics across the state, including restoration, preservation of old-growth forests, and environmental education in public schools. Wilhelmina was also the first woman to serve on the Wisconsin Conservation Congress.
Well, I would say that her involvement on the Horicon Marsh issue was like it was on every issue that she was involved in. That she allied herself with other conservationists. Often the conservationists that she aligned with were men, and she wrote lots of letters.
Wilhelmina had a likable nature and an ability to get along with everyone. Dr. Thomas recalls running into someone who did not share enthusiasm with La Budde's cause.
And then she went on to tell this story about in her own house, Wilhelmina was lobbying against her interests. And then she went on to say, this is now the woman whose interests were being lobbied against, I liked her. Don't get me wrong, I liked her. Everybody liked her, she said. And so I think one of the ways that she was successful is that she didn't take things personally, that she stuck to the issues, that she was kind and polite and enthusiastic and charming, and even if you disagreed with her, you couldn't help but like her. She understood that you didn't do things by yourself, that it took support from a lot of people to get anything good to happen. I think she was a great woman. She was smart, and she knew how to get along with people, and she cared a lot about the things that she cared about, and she worked hard to make sure that the world was a better place. And the world is a better place because Wilhelmina La Budde was in it. Women, of course, were very interested in education in those days, as many of them are today. And she had a lot of involvement in the clubs on these issues. She had a lot of involvement with the Wisconsin Conservation Department. She had a lot of involvement with conservationists from all around the state. It wasn't just Wilhelmina, it was conservationists statewide, but she was a major player in this. And today, even today, that legislation is still in effect and even has been enhanced over the years. And we have environmental education in the schools in our state as a result of the work of Wilhelmina.
Wilhelmina La Budde shared her love of nature by being persistent and by banding together with other conservationists. Beginning in 1908, Pearl Pohl was a public school teacher who took a personal interest in teaching environmental issues. Pearl was a pioneer in getting students outside by coordinating all-day field trips, planting trees, organizing cleanup projects, and teaching students how to write letters to Congress. When she retired in 1953, Pearl continued to be a dedicated leader in conservation for almost 3 decades.
Pearl was an elementary teacher in the Milwaukee schools. She taught 6th grade for much of her life, but her education went far beyond the 6th grade students that she had. Pearl marched to her own beat, that she used current events for teaching. She used the newspapers, she used the local issues, and she took the children out of doors. The school principal got many calls that the children should be inside the building during school hours, not outside. Yet the principals recognized her abilities and gave her permission. When you talked to Pearl, she looked you straight in the eye and had your full attention. She would not waver, and you were the most important person in her life at that time. With her own money, and again, teachers are not well paid at that time, with her meager retirement, when an issue came up, she would drive alone from Milwaukee to Madison to appear on a legislative matter. I know a number of times, in snow, storm, I would meet her and I would help her park her car, and we would go into the state chambers. They knew her well there, even in her 70s. Pearl, being of very modest means, yet she moved right through all of these high, falutin societies. And you got to remember that Pearl did this when women were not accepted as any leaders. They were not accepted as anyone with any knowledge. They were not accepted as anyone with leadership qualities or others. It was strictly a man's, and still is to some degree today. And she fought tremendous odds with prejudice and ridicule to get what she did, and yet she was never put down by it. And I think for this reason, even though some other professionals are credited with greater achievements, the odds that Pearl Pohl and some of these other leaders during that time really had to be recognized for what they did. It makes me feel bad to think back on that, to see how they're treated. I think Pearl's great achievement was instilling a sense of virtue and need for respect for the out of doors. Pearl Pohl, I think in summary, was an example of a person that we should all try to emulate.
Because of the conservation education work of Wilhelmina, Pearl, and many others, Horicon Marsh is a classroom for children today. Indoor and outdoor programs are offered to school children from across Wisconsin. Special events and public speakers are programmed throughout the year. Researchers from across the world come to Horicon Marsh to learn about wetland restoration. But the work in Wisconsin is never done. What can you do? How can you help with conservation issues in your hometown? The inductees in the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame had the foresight to act on their feelings of personal responsibility. How can you use the inductees' legacies as inspiration in your own life?